Good morning. Thank you all for having me, although I'm still kind of mad that you stole Tammy away. But I would like to thank Katie and the Piedmont Health Foundation and other co-sponsors for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in the Upstate. So one morning, two fish are swimming down the Reedy River, and they encounter a third fish swimming the other way, who cheerily says, "Good morning, how's the water?" And the fish swim along, and one of them says to the other, "What's water?" We're living in revolutionary times. Over the last century, land use rules were adopted throughout the U.S. that were aimed at manipulating the physical environment to encourage and stimulate consumption. And now, well-meaning people are paid to administer the rules that were adopted, and countless hours are spent debating ways to make them better. At the local government level, a tremendous amount of public discourse is spent on abstractions such as what qualifies as appropriate number of parking spaces or units per acre or depth of building setbacks for a given development. The entire bureaucratic structure is set up to support a narrative that was advanced by planners and politicians of the early 20th century, under the premise that such rules were necessary to maintain some artificial, predetermined order. Furthermore, that's the way it's always been. Well, that's not the case. And one way to understand our environment is to compare it to other environments. This can include other places, as well as our own environment through time. So I'm going to take you on a history tour through time, because we don't want to be fish who are unaware of the environment. Awareness is the first step. Cities are among the oldest forms of human organization. The oldest religions are Judaism and Hinduism. They're about 5,000 years old. The oldest universities are in France and Italy. They're about 1,000 years old. Stora Enso in Sweden is the oldest corporation, 700 years old. But Jericho in Israel has been continuously occupied for about 10,000 years. And up until the mid-20th century, roughly, Jericho's pattern of human settlement was the one that Western civilization followed. Now, I'd like to point out two characteristics of this pattern. These are some of the oldest urban design guidelines that I've found. They're referenced in 35th chapter of Numbers, the fourth book of the Bible, where Moses receives these instructions from God in the plains of Moab across the Jordan River from Jericho, no less. He basically says the cities are where people will live, and the suburbs will be for their pastures and their cattle and their farms and their vineyards. And he gives specific numbers, specific in cubits that are, one cubit is about 18 inches. So he gives the dimensions of how big the suburbs are going to be. Doesn't go into great detail about doesn't go into any detail about how the cities will be. But inside, he says there'll be walls, they'll be framed, and the suburbs will be framed. When you frame something, when you put boundaries around it, it simplifies things. And he had this relationship, right? So each city, if you read down at the bottom, God didn't say, "Hey, Moses, go over to Jericho and build a subdivision in the suburbs." That would have been easier, right? They've been established for a long time. No, he said build 48 cities. Each of them would have suburbs. Each of them would be independent and have this agrarian relationship with its resources for its people right outside its city walls. So that's one point. There's a lot of points about traditional urbanism that I could get into, but I'm just going to focus on two. This and the other is networks. So all cities up until the 20th century, they were defined by these networks. Some were very structured grids, and others were more organic. And this is Beaufort. This is the historic area of Beaufort. The core of it was laid out in 1712. It gradually grew to about 300 acres in 1960. And in Beaufort, you see the street network. There are many ways to get from place to place. It's mixed use. You can walk, and you can bike, and you can drive. There's multiple ways. And people have been talking about this for 2,000 years. Jesus, on the Sermon on the Mount at the end, said, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. And many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." So, Jesus, the transportation engineer. I used to say, keep this in mind if you're arguing with a traffic engineer or something, no, we got to have more lanes and big roads. Well, remind them of that. Now, our work involves taking lessons from places like historic Charleston and combining those with modern advances in building new places. We are particularly interested in the public realm. That's what distinguishes, I think, our work from any. We want to create a beautiful public realm. Another nearby example is right out the door of this hotel. Main Street was reshaped into a beautiful public realm that complements the private realm and provides a wonderful place for people to engage and interact. This is Craven Street in Beaufort, and planners sometimes think of the outdoor room, the concept of an outdoor room along a street. And to explain that, here, the floor of this room, the pavement, sidewalks, grass, homes are built that the facades are the walls of this room, and then trees are planted that grow up eventually and form a canopy. And that's this kind of spatial relationship that we feel that we're in. If the wall is narrow enough. If it gets too wide, the buildings are too far apart, you lose that sense of enclosure. But that's what we focused on, and the work we've done. Just here in the top left is New Point. Below that is the village at Port Royal, and in the middle up is Broad Street in Beaufort, Hammond's Ferry in North Augusta. Upper right is 4th of July party at Ion in Mount Pleasant. Below that is East Beach and Norfolk. And then over the last 10, 12 years, we've been focused on more infill development. The top is Moore Square and Mixon in Charleston and North Charleston. Below that is a project called Catfiddle Street that I'm involved in, and to the right is a little neighborhood in the old village of Mount Pleasant called Earl's Court. So again, our focus is on this public realm. It's the relationship. Most people look at the houses and like, oh, these are so pretty and traditional. It's the relationship between the public realm and the private realm that is important to us. And so we try to build a public realm that complements the private realm, that adds value to the private realm, but also is just a nice place for people to engage. And we don't force people to meet one another, but it just lends itself to people coming in contact with one another, and that helps form the bonds of community. So why did we shift? Why do we abandon the traditional approach to development in favor of something else? And why do we continue to perpetuate this model despite some of the problems with it? To answer that, I want to take you on a tour of some of the underground history of American urbanism. Now, when Columbus discovered America, he brought with him a 9,500-year-old tradition of city building. But he also discovered that the indigenous Americans had their own tradition of city building. And from St. Augustine, the oldest city in North America, up through the Enlightenment cities of Charleston and Savannah, we started developing this wonderful tradition of American urbanism, such that by the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, we'd been doing this for over 220 years. In the closing hours of the Constitutional Convention, a big part of the Constitutional Convention was about powers, how much we'd give up to the federal government. And the big rivalry at the time was not north-south so much as it was big states, small states. Big states like Pennsylvania and Virginia wanted more power and more representation. The small states were resistant to that. So at the end, in the closing hours of the convention, Ben Franklin brought up a proposal to grant Congress the power to fund infrastructure. And Roger Sherman of Connecticut protested, saying we shouldn't tax everybody for the benefit of a few. That wouldn't work out. We could end up with bridges to nowhere. So Franklin's proposal was defeated 8-3. Despite that, there were efforts to try to get the federal government back involved in infrastructure funding. In his last act as president, the father of the Constitution, James Madison, vetoed a legislation, a congressional bill to fund infrastructure. And he was followed by other presidents, Andrew Jackson, John Tyler, and then in Polk's administration, there was he actually wrote a lot about it. If you want to understand a good history of infrastructure funding up to this point, read Polk's veto message from December 15th, 1847, where he goes and details all what had been happening, and he vetoed this bill. He said it was like a bad idea. But then about the same time, there was a fella in Europe named Karl Marx who was advancing a new narrative, a new agenda, a revolutionary program. And among the things he and Engels suggested in the Communist Manifesto was things like a progressive income tax and a central bank. But another was to gradually abolish this distinction between city and country. So compare that, Marx's vision, to that of God's in Numbers. Anyway, a congressman at the time, Abraham Lincoln, protested Polk's veto, and he thought we should have more centralized funding. We should get the federal government involved. Nevertheless, other presidents that came after continued to support this idea, Franklin Pierce and then James Buchanan toward the end, that we shouldn't have the federal government involved in infrastructure funding. But despite the fact that the framers had agreed to that and 7 presidents had said no, the federal government should not be involved, in 1860 at the Republican National Convention, they passed a platform that said we should be involved, the federal government should be involved. They elected a dark horse candidate who was a big corporate attorney representing railroad companies and northern banks named Abraham Lincoln. He won. Their idea was you hear talk about the Civil War. Some people say, well, it was about the tariff, raising the tariff rates, which the South didn't like. No one ever talks about the fact what they wanted to do with the higher taxes. What they wanted to do is get the federal government involved in building infrastructure to benefit industry. So anyway, the South pulled out. We know what happens. Interestingly, right after Lincoln's first inaugural address, the Confederates ratified their Constitution, which sought to revamp or reboot the U.S. Constitution and add some language to prohibit any kind of crony capitalism, any kind of corporate welfare, particularly with regard to funding infrastructure. But that didn't last. Actually, once this was made public, the Northern press went berserk. This is an example from Boston Evening Transcript from March 18th. They said because the South was basically going for a free trade zone, that all the trade from New York and Philadelphia and Boston was going to go to the South. It was going to go to Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. So that couldn't stand. Led to what I call the war over infrastructure funding. And I'm going to skip through some slides if you want. I think this is being recorded if you want to go back and and look at some of these. They'll be in the presentation. But post-war analysis after the war, Lord Acton was a British parliamentarian and champion of liberty. And he wrote to Robert E. Lee in a famous correspondence talking about the Confederate Constitution and these reforms. And Lee wrote back, concerned that the consolidation of the states would lead to some problems. So after the war, we restructured the government to be more like the Hamiltonian vision of a stronger centralized government. Toward the end of the 19th century, Supreme Court, through a series of major decisions, passed laws to rewrite the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to enable Congress to fund infrastructure. That culminated in a case, Wilson versus Shaw, which was actually about funding the Panama Canal. But in that, they ruled that these authorities recognize the power of Congress to fund interstate highways. So that opened the door. Basically, you had, if you think about transportation in the context of history, over the preceding years, you'd had all this innovation: steamships, trains, bicycles, streetcars, automobiles, electric streetcars, and then that basically stopped. I mean, we have more powerful cars, they're safer now, but they're basically the same internal combustion engine, 4 tires and a steering wheel that Henry Ford was building years ago. Lobbyists, when we centralized the infrastructure funding, lobbyists got involved in a big way. Also, this back to Marx, his ideas about centralized bank and progressive income tax, those were adopted in 1913 to provide the federal government a source of funding for major projects like wars and infrastructure funding. You have these big lobby groups. This is the first Federal Road Act was in 1916, second one in 1921. Again, lobbying. Ford, there was people, the Model T had made it much easier to afford a car, so the cities were becoming congested, and Ford's idea was, we'll just blow out, we'll get the federal government to fund all this infrastructure, and we'll leave the city. This was echoed by some European planners, Le Corbusier being chief among them, who said this would stimulate the economy, if we built in this manner. This is President Harding in 1922, echoing the same. Something happened in the 20s. It was basically what I call the urban enclosure movement. Prior to this time, everyone had equal access to the public realm. After that time, we shifted these backing up. You had this huge number of fatalities. They were happening on city streets, mostly children, to the point that major cities were erecting monuments to children killed in the street each year. This is in Baltimore. So the organized motordom, as they called themselves, realized something has to happen with this, and so they began to shift the vision for a city street to be for the exclusive use of motorists. So they took it away from the population at large, so we focused on motoring. The fascist governments of Italy and Germany were the first to build big road projects through their central governments. It's kind of consumer economy emerging. This is just more articles of the time, editorials about the mayhem and the death in the streets. Streetcar companies actually pushed back against this idea of making the street all about the car, but they didn't get very far. So as I was saying, the fascist governments in Italy and Germany began to build these big road projects. Hitler came to power in 1933, and they started working on the Autobahn. There was a big road congress in Berlin and Munich in 1934, in which people from all over the world, including the United States, came to see the Autobahns. This is one of Hitler's henchmen, Rudolf Hess, welcoming everyone. The Americans we were totally enamored with this. this idea, just get rid of the old city and spread out. Thomas MacDonald was chief of the Bureau of Public Roads. He actually went and visited with Hitler and taught a few times and came back to America with the idea, well, these Autobahns are great and all, but they're putting them at the exterior of the cities. We need to build them right through the middle. So that's where the idea came from. It was shaped up in the late 30s. This is Toll Roads and Free Roads put out by McDonald at the Bureau of Public Roads. You can see the vision for the new city, cutting big roads through the middle of our cities. Just some slides from Toll Roads and Free Roads. Franklin Delano Roosevelt endorsed it. Right after he did, General Motors came out with this World's Fair exhibit called Futurama, which basically depicted the vision at the New York World's Fair. The vision continued to be shaped up, and in 1945 or 1944 was put forward in this document with more images of what the cities would be like. This is a meeting with FDR and the King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia in February 1945, where we agreed to protect Saudi Arabia. And so the vision was already in place in the 40s. It wasn't funded until 1956. And just some slides about how this program, what happened in Charleston region, which I'm most familiar, but it really happened all over the country. And this is an article from 1957 where they say, rather than end I-26 short of Charleston, we'll build it right into the middle of downtown. So cities were under siege, right, with these this automobile mentality. Just an example of, and from Mount Pleasant. I didn't go into zoning. We can talk about that some more. Charleston adopted it in 1932. Mount Pleasant in 1949 when it was 300 acres. But Mount Pleasant, the 1956 bill allowed this highway expansion. So Coleman Boulevard, some of you may be familiar with, was the first big road developed and widened in Coleman. And now Mount Pleasant, so it was about 2,000 people living on 300 acres in 1950. Now it's 85,000 people on 30,000 acres. So this kind of federal funding of this and state funding of this vision enabled us to just kind of metastasize the growth pattern. This is, I mentioned earlier about the pattern of growth that was put forward in God's urban design guidelines with boundaries. Well, Mount Pleasant had a boundary street. A lot of cities had boundary streets or line streets or wall streets. And Mount Pleasant has a boundary. This was the boundary before this new vision was adopted. And we were really, some places, now we were warned about this. People like Jane Jacobs and Lewis Mumford and others warned us about this. But we were so enamored with it and so excited to get all this federal money that we couldn't resist. Now, I think I'm about out of time, so I'm going to skip to the end. We have this kind of auto mind, as I call it, automobile mind. And I want to take you back to a movie. One of my favorite movies is The Truman Show. You'll remember that from 1995. It stars Jim Carrey, and it's the movie tells the story of Truman Burbank, who's adopted by a corporation and raised in a reality TV show. And everyone in the show, besides Truman, even his wife and his best friend, are actors. But Truman is unaware of that, and he's unaware he's living in this simulated reality. Gradually, he starts figuring it out, that his world is artificial. And in a scene midway through the movie, a reporter is interviewing the show's director, whose name is Christoph, who's played by Ed Harris. And he asks, why do you think Truman has never come close to discovering the true nature of his world until now? And Christoph responds, we accept the reality of the world with which we are presented. It's as simple as that. I think this is right. We tend to accept the world we've been presented. We're like fish who are not aware of the water. But the Truman Show only worked if Truman believed in it. He was trapped in his beliefs. Baby boomers, of which I'm one, I was born in 1964, were handed some really bad ideas about urbanism at a time when the U.S. was the world's biggest creditor. Ideas that experience was already showing wasn't working. And with apparent little capacity for introspection, self-reflection, self-criticism, or accountability, we didn't question it. And now we're the world's biggest debtor. We continue to perpetuate this vision, but we're slowly waking up. The planning ideology is crumbling under mountains of debt and disorder, and people are realizing there's more to life than speed and resenting one's neighbor. From the Judeo-Christian ethos and the cultural seeds of self-reliance and self-sufficiency sprang the spirit of American independence, and we need to reclaim that. We offloaded responsibility, personal responsibility, community responsibility to the state and federal governments. We need to reclaim that. That's our cultural heritage, and y'all have already started doing that. And I would encourage you to do more of it. So, thank you.